You know, our world is absolutely shaped by these powerful, unseen forces. What's so interesting is that some of them we can measure with like terrifying precision, while others, well, you can only really feel those through pure devotion. Right, some of these forces, we've managed to pin them down with cold, hard science. We've learned to quantify their invisible danger in these units, called sieverts. But then you have the others, and you can't capture them with any instrument we've ever invented. Their power is felt, it's not measured. And their unit of measurement, well, I guess you could say it's devotion. Okay, so here's what we're going to get into. How do these two completely different worlds, the scientific and the spiritual, deal with things they can't even see? We'll take a look at the measurable force of radiation, then the pervasive force of divinity, see how we learn from both, and finally, explore how we choose to respond to that kind of power. You know, it's pretty amazing. Both scientists and ancient sages basically agree on one thing. The most powerful forces that shape our reality are actually the ones we can't see. So let's start with the scientific side of things. We're talking about a force that, while it's totally invisible, has a very tangible, quantifiable, and, let's be honest, sometimes really dangerous impact on our world. High-energy radiation. And just so we're clear, this isn't the kind of radiation from your Wi-Fi or your phone. We're talking about ionizing radiation. Energy so powerful, it can literally rip electrons right off of atoms. Getting a dose of this stuff is a serious business, and it's all measured in those units we mentioned, sieverts. And to really wrap your head around the scale of this invisible power, you don't need some deep philosophical text. You just need to look at the data. Believe me, the numbers themselves tell a pretty terrifying and fascinating story. All right, so picture this. If you were standing in the Chernobyl exclusion zone right now, a Geiger counter would be clicking away at about 5 microsieverts per hour. If you stayed for an hour, that's about the same dose you'd get from a dental x-ray. It's definitely elevated, but, manageable. But watch what happens when we go to the basement of the Pripyat hospital. Whoa, the reading jumps through the roof. And the reason why, because this is where they threw the contaminated clothing of the firefighters, the very first responders. This quote from someone who was actually there really puts it all into perspective. The numbers aren't just abstract data points, are they? They represent a real, tangible, and incredibly dangerous unseen presence. Okay, so now let's do a complete 180. Let's pivot from a force we try to measure and contain to one that by its very nature is just immeasurable. We're shifting from the localized danger of radiation to the idea of an all-encompassing invisible presence. The source material we're looking at describes this divine force, Krishna, not as a point of energy you can locate, but as something boundless, infinite, all-pervading, just like the sky. How do you measure something like that? You just can't. And this really shows the fundamental difference in how these two forces operate. The disappearance of the divine isn't an end. It's described more like the sun's setting. You know it's going to rise again. It's this unbreakable, transcendental cycle. And that's in such stark contrast to a person's death, right? Which is seen as the final end of a physical body, just subject to the laws of nature. So we've got this localized danger on one hand and this all-pervading presence on the other. So how do we actually learn about forces like these? How does the world itself become our teacher? Well, with a force like radiation, our path to knowledge is pretty active. It's all about measurement with our tools, direct observation of the effects, and controlled experiments. We're basically probing the world to make it tell us its secrets. But then, there's a totally different way of knowing. The spiritual texts talk about a wise sage who didn't use any instruments at all. Instead, he learned just by passively observing the world around him, treating the elements of nature as his 24 gurus or teachers. And the lessons he learned were, well, they were profound. From the earth, the sage learned tolerance. From the sun, which takes water only to give it back as rain, he learned detachment. He saw the moon's changing phases as a lesson that the soul stays the same, even as our bodies wax and wane. And get this, from a single bangle, he learned the value of solitude. Because, a lot of bangles together just make a lot of noise. So this fundamental difference in how we learn leads us to the ultimate question. When we're faced with these immense, unseen powers, how do we, as humans, actually respond to them? And this slide just nails the core difference. When we're faced with radiation, our response is all about control. We measure it, we contain it, we mitigate it. The goal is physical management. But the response to divinity? It's the complete opposite. It's connection. The path is through devotion, which is known as bhakti yoga, and surrender and service. The goal isn't to contain the force, but to align with it.
So one force is managed through physical control. It's our attempt to master the physical world, to put boundaries around a danger. And the other is embraced through spiritual connection. It's an act of surrender, trying to find our place within a much larger force.
Which really just leaves us with a final thought to chew on. You could say science maps the physical world, its forces, and its laws. And spirituality, well, it maps our inner world, its purpose, and its meaning. But are they really two different paths? Or could they just be two different maps, drawn from different perspectives of the very same reality?